Well, the most recent data shows more than two-thirds of Chinese buyers paid all cash to buy property in the U.S., while the rest took out mortgages to finance their purchases. Let's look now at how investments by overseas investors plays out in American cities and communities that attract that foreign capital. Richard Florida is the founder of the advisory firm Creative Class Group, is the author of Who's Your City? How the Creative Economy is Making the Place Where You Live the Most Important Decision of Your Life. There's probably no greater expert on cities around. Richard, good to see you. This is a really interesting story to me. First of all, there's this issue of people who have money to invest choosing property in America. Brazilians do it, Russians do it, and now we're finding individual Chinese, not the Chinese government, not Chinese multinationals. America just seems to be a good investment to people with money.
Yeah, and it's funny because Canadians are the #1 investor, followed by Chinese. And, of course, the Chinese are pouring money into Toronto and Vancouver as well as U.S. cities. But I think what we're looking at is the globalization of the real estate market. When you and I were young, you know, Mom and Dad and our relatives bought a house in the town where they grew up. What's happened now is the real estate game has become global. But it's not every city, and it's interesting. Of course, the Chinese are not just going to New York and L.A. They are putting that money in Detroit and Las Vegas, where there's great value. But it's a very small group of cities. What I like to say is the world isn't flat. The world is spiky. And when it comes to real estate investment, that investment from international buyers, foreign buyers in America, is going to New York, to L.A., if you're Latin American, less Asian, greater Miami, a little bit in San Francisco and a few other places, but it is very highly concentrated. You know, the 6% figure was average. In some of these places, it's 25, 30, 40, 50% of all investment is international. But in most places across the United States, it's less than 3%.
Well, you named a few cities, all right? You talked about New York, you talked about L.A., you talked about Miami, and then you talked about Toronto and Vancouver, all places where if you live in those places already and you try and buy property, you are in many cases competing with bidders from other places. So a whole lot of people who say this foreign money is bidding me out of the market. Beyond that, socioeconomically, good or bad for American cities to have all this foreign investment?
Oh, it's absolutely good. You know, 20 years ago, people said the Japanese were going to buy up Rockefeller Center. The Japanese were going to buy up the Rust Belt. Japanese investment put a lot of American manufacturing firms back on track. They invested in those companies. They poured money into it. I mean, the fact that Chinese investors are buying not only, you know, those trophy properties in downtown New York, but they're buying in Flushing, you know, which is a big Chinese and Chinese-American community. The fact that they're buying in Toledo and Detroit, you know, bought the Detroit Free Press building that was going to ruin, those are good things, and they help to stabilize communities. But, of course, as you said, sometimes it makes it a little bit tougher slog. You know, it's like going to college. And when I was going to college, I was competing against kids from my neighborhood. Right. Now you go to college, you're competing from kids from around the world. The same thing in these big spiky cities, these big major cities. If you want to buy a property in some of those great downtown neighborhoods, you are competing against investors from the world. But that money is making the city stronger, even though it may be making it more expensive for you, the consumer.
You mentioned Toledo. You know, this is a city that suffered a lot. It was a big manufacturing city. It's now less of a manufacturing city. There's a waterfront area that the Chinese bought. This is, you know, Chinese bigger investors. These are not individual investors, bought in and hopefully will get developed over time. So double-edged sword. People worry about those prices going up, but it does put a floor on some of these depressed communities and gives some money to those places.
And it's interesting where the money is going. It's going into the downtown locations of the big, great global cities, but it's going into waterfront areas. You know, one of the things we found is there's a great demand for waterfront, whether it's waterfront housing or waterfront retail, almost all across the country. And if you can get a nice site, you know, that's kind of quasi-abandoned on the river. But in general, it's a very – and the other thing is we know that one of the things that spurs economic revitalization overall, but in a distressed city, is foreign people, immigrants. Immigrants are a spur. You know, look at what happened in Toronto, a city we both know. 50% foreign-born, spurred that city, drove it, you know, created a great energy level. The more foreign-born people, immigrants you have in a Detroit, a Cleveland, a Pittsburgh, the Toledo, the better that city's going to grow, the more entrepreneurial energy it's going to have.
Always great to see you. Thank you so much. Richard Florida is the founder of Creative Class Group. Good to see you, Richard.
Thank you,
Hey, if you're a small retailer in America, the next week might be make or break for you. Coming up, I'm visiting the owner of a small toy shop in America's heartland about what she's doing to compete with the big chains. Coming up on Real Money.